Welcome back to From Wreck to Remarkable. Today we're talking about something that strikes fear into the hearts of many property developers and renovators, the Party Wall Act. Now I'll be honest, the Party Wall Act has a bit of a reputation. People think it's complicated, expensive, and a source of endless disputes with neighbors. And yes, it can be all of those things if you don't handle it properly. But if you understand the act and follow the correct procedures, it's actually quite straightforward. Let me start with a story that shows what can happen if you ignore the Party Wall Act. I knew a developer called Chris who bought a mid-terrace house in London. He planned to do a side return extension and a loft conversion. Both of these involved work to the party walls, which are the shared walls with the neighbors on either side. Chris had heard about the Party Wall Act, but he thought it was optional or just a formality. He decided not to bother with it and just got on with the work. About 2 weeks into the project, one of his neighbors noticed the work and realized Chris hadn't served a party wall notice. The neighbor was furious. They contacted a party wall surveyor and issued a legal challenge. The work had to stop immediately. Chris then had to go through the party wall process retrospectively, which is much more difficult and expensive than doing it properly from the start. The neighbor, understandably annoyed, appointed a surveyor who was very thorough and insisted on extensive protective measures. The whole process took 3 months and cost Chris over £8,000 in surveyor fees and additional protective works. If he'd just followed the correct procedure from the start, it would have cost him a fraction of that and caused no delay. That's the risk of ignoring the Party Wall Act. It's not optional, it's the law, and if you don't comply, your neighbor can stop your project in its tracks. So what is the Party Wall Act? And when does it apply? The Party Wall, etc. Act 1996 is a piece of legislation that applies in England and Wales. It provides a framework for preventing and resolving disputes in relation to party walls, boundary walls, and excavations near neighbouring buildings. The Act gives building owners the right to carry out certain types of work, but it also gives neighbouring owners protection and the right to be notified and to have their interests protected. The Act applies in 3 main situations. First, work directly to an existing party wall or party structure. A party wall is a wall that stands on the boundary between 2 properties and is shared by both owners. This includes the wall between 2 semi-detached houses or between terraced houses. If you want to do work to a party wall, for example cutting into it to insert a beam, raising it or underpinning it, the Act applies. Second, building a new wall on the boundary. If you want to build a new wall right on the boundary line between your property and your neighbor's property, the Act applies. This is called building on the line of junction. Third, excavating near a neighboring building. If you're digging foundations or doing other excavation within 3 meters of a neighboring building, and the excavation will go deeper than the neighbor's foundations, the Act applies. Or if you're excavating within 6 meters of a neighboring building and the excavation will go deeper than a line drawn at 45 degrees from the bottom of the neighbor's foundations, the Act applies. These situations are actually quite common in refurbishment projects. If you're building an extension on a semi-detached or terraced house, you're almost certainly going to be working on or near a party wall. If you're digging foundations close to a neighbor's property, the excavation provisions might apply. So what do you have to do if the Act applies? The first step is to serve a notice on your neighbor. There are 3 types of notice depending on the type of work. A party structure notice is used for work directly to an existing party wall or party structure. This notice must be served at least 2 months before you intend to start work. A line of junction. Notice is used if you're building a new wall on the boundary. This must also be served at least 2 months before you start work. A notice of adjacent excavation is used if you're excavating near a neighboring building. This must be served at least 1 month before you start work. The notice must include details of the work you're planning to do when you intend to start, and drawings showing the work. There are specific requirements for what the notice must contain, and it's important to get this right, because if the notice is defective, it's not valid. Once you've served the notice, your neighbor has 14 days to respond. They can either consent to the work, in which case you can proceed, or they can dissent, which means they don't consent. If they don't respond within 14 days, they're deemed to have dissented. Now, here's the key thing. Dissent doesn't mean your neighbor can stop the work. It just means that a dispute is deemed to have arisen, and the dispute needs to be resolved by surveyors. If there's a dispute, either because your neighbor has dissented or because they haven't responded, you need to appoint surveyors. There are two options. Either each party appoints their own surveyor and those two surveyors work together, or both parties agree to appoint a single surveyor called an agreed surveyor. The surveyors will inspect the properties, assess the proposed work, and produce a document called a party wall award. The award sets out what work can be done, what protective measures need to be taken, when the work can be carried out, and how any damage will be dealt with. The award is legally binding on both parties. The surveyors will also arrange for a schedule of condition to be prepared. This is a detailed record, usually with photos, of the condition of the neighbor's property before the work starts. This is really important because if there's any damage during the work, the schedule of condition provides evidence of what the property was like beforehand. Once the award is in place, you can proceed with the work, as long as you comply with the terms of the award. Now, let's talk about costs. If your neighbor consents to the work, there are no surveyor costs. But if there's a dispute and surveyors need to be appointed, there are fees. Each surveyor will charge a fee, typically between £700 and £2,000, depending on the complexity of the work and the location. The Act says that the building owner, that's you, the person doing the work, is responsible for paying the reasonable costs of both surveyors. Yes, you read that right. You pay for your surveyor and your neighbor's surveyor. This can feel unfair, but it's the way the Act works. The logic is that you're the one doing the work, so you should bear the cost of the process. However, the cost must be reasonable, and if you think a surveyor is charging excessive fees, you can challenge it. Let me give you an example of a party wall process that went smoothly. I worked with a couple, Laura and Ben, in South London. They were planning a rear extension on their mid-terrace house. The extension involved building up to the party walls on both sides and excavating foundations close to both neighbors' properties. So the Party Wall Act definitely applied. 2 months before they wanted to start work, Laura and Ben served party structure notices and notices of adjacent excavation on both neighbors. They included detailed drawings and a letter explaining the work and the party wall process. One neighbor consented immediately. The other neighbor didn't respond within 14 days, so they were deemed to have dissented. Laura and Ben appointed a surveyor, and the neighbor also appointed a surveyor. The two surveyors inspected the properties, agreed on the protective measures needed, and produced a party wall award. The award required Laura and Ben to underpin the neighbor's foundations, protect the party wall during the work, and allow the neighbor's surveyor to inspect the work at key stages. A schedule of condition was prepared for the neighbor's property. The work went ahead as planned. The neighbor's surveyor inspected a couple of times to make sure everything was being done properly. There was no damage, and the project was completed without any issues. The total surveyor fees were about £2,500, which Laura and Ben had budgeted for. That's how the Party Wall Act should work. Proper notices, surveyors appointed if needed, an award in place, and the work proceeds smoothly. Now let me give you an example of where it went wrong. A guy called Mark was doing a loft conversion on his semi-detached house. The conversion involved raising the party wall between his property and his neighbors. Mark knew he should serve a party wall notice, but he kept putting it off. Eventually, he started the work without serving a notice. His neighbor noticed the work and was not happy. The neighbor contacted the surveyor, who wrote to Mark pointing out that he was in breach of the Party Wall Act. The neighbor surveyor insisted that the work stop immediately until the party wall process was completed. Mark had to stop work, which meant his builders were standing around doing nothing and he was still paying them. He then had to serve a retrospective party structure notice. The neighbor dissented and surveyors were appointed. Because Mark had already started work, the neighbor surveyor was particularly cautious and insisted on extensive protective measures and monitoring. The whole process took 6 weeks, during which Mark's project was on hold. The surveyor fees came to over £4,000, and Mark also had to pay his builders for the time they were delayed. In total, the delay and extra costs came to about £10,000. And if Mark had just served the notice 2 months before starting work, the process would have been much simpler and cheaper. So what are the most common disputes and how can you avoid them? One common dispute is about damage. Your neighbor might claim that your work has caused cracks or other damage to their property. This is why the schedule of condition is so important. It provides a record of the condition before the work started, so you can see whether damage is new or was already there. To avoid damage, make sure your builders work carefully. Follow the protective measures set out in the party wall award and allow the neighbor surveyor to inspect the work. If damage does occur, deal with it promptly and fairly. Another common dispute is about noise and disruption. Your neighbor might complain about the noise, dust, or inconvenience of the work. The Party Wall Act doesn't directly deal with this, but it's good practice to be considerate. Let your neighbor know when noisy work will be happening, stick to reasonable working hours, and minimize disruption where possible. A third common dispute is about the cost of surveyors. Your neighbor might appoint a surveyor who charges high fees, and you're responsible for paying them. If you think the fees are unreasonable, you can challenge them. The Act says you only have to pay reasonable fees, and if you can't agree, you can refer the matter to a third surveyor for a decision. To avoid disputes, communicate with your neighbor. Explain what you're planning to do, why you're doing it, and how long it will take. Most disputes arise from poor communication and misunderstandings. If your neighbor understands what's happening and feels informed and respected, they're much less likely to cause problems. Here are my top tips for dealing with the Party Wall Act. 1. Identify early whether the Act applies to your project. If you're doing any work to a party wall, building on a boundary, or excavating near a neighbor's property, the Act probably applies. 2. Serve the correct notice at the correct time. Party structure. Notices and line of junction notices must be served at least 2 months before you start work. Notices of adjacent excavation must be served at least 1 month before. 3. Use a template or get professional help to draft the notice. There are specific requirements for what the notice must contain, and if you get it wrong, the notice might not be valid. In the full course, there's a party wall notice template that my students use, which makes this much easier. 4. Communicate with your neighbor. Explain the work, the party wall process, and what will happen. Most neighbors are reasonable if they're kept informed. 5. If surveyors need to be appointed, choose a good one. Look for a surveyor who's experienced, professional, and reasonable. A good surveyor will keep costs down and resolve issues efficiently. 6. Budget for surveyor fees. If there's a dispute, you'll be paying for both surveyors, so factor this into your project budget. Typically budget between £1,500 and £3,000 for surveyor fees, though it can be more for complex projects. 7. Comply with the Party Wall Award. Once the award is in place, follow it. Allow inspections, implement the protective measures, and work carefully to avoid damage. And 8. Keep records. Keep copies of all notices, the Party Wall Award, the schedule of condition, and any correspondence. These documents are important if there's any dispute later. Let me share one more story that shows the value of getting this right. I had a student, Imran, who was developing a terraced house in Birmingham. He was doing a major refurbishment, including a side return extension and a loft conversion. Both involved work to the party walls. Imran served party structure notices on both neighbors 3 months before he wanted to start work. He included detailed drawings and a covering letter explaining the work. He also knocked on both neighbors' doors and had a chat with them about the project. One neighbor consented. The other neighbor was a bit concerned about potential damage, so they dissented. Imran appointed a surveyor, and the neighbor appointed their own surveyor. The two surveyors worked together, produced a party wall award, and arranged for a schedule of condition. During the work, the neighbor surveyor inspected a couple of times. Everything was fine. At the end of the project, the neighbor surveyor confirmed there was no damage. The neighbor was happy, and Imran had a good relationship with them. A year later, Imran sold the property. The buyer's solicitor asked about the party wall process. Imran provided copies of the notices, the award, and the final confirmation from the neighbor surveyor that there was no damage. The buyer was reassured, and the sale went through smoothly. That's the value of doing it properly. It protects you, it protects your neighbor, and it makes everything smoother in the long run. So to recap, the Party Wall Act applies if you're doing work to a party wall, building on a boundary, or excavating near a neighbor's property. You must serve the correct notice at least 1 or 2 months before starting work. If your neighbor dissents or doesn't respond, surveyors are appointed to produce a party wall award. You're responsible for paying the reasonable costs of both surveyors. To avoid disputes, communicate with your neighbor, work carefully, and comply with the awards. In the next episode, we're going to look at special situations like conservation areas, listed buildings, tree preservation orders, and other constraints that can add extra layers of complexity to your project. If your property falls into any of these categories, you need to know about it before you start work. Your action step for this episode is to think about whether the Party Wall Act applies to your project. If you're doing work to a shared wall or excavating near a neighbor's property, it probably does. Make a note of when you need to serve notices and start thinking about how you'll communicate with your neighbors. The earlier you deal with this, the smoother your project will be. Thanks for listening. I'll see you in the next episode where we tackle special situations and additional constraints.